all about that. But another person might say, well, how will our pastor be credentialed? How will our pastor be a pastor after we disaffiliate, if we choose to disaffiliate? Well, I actually don't know the answer to that, right? Because your pastor will withdraw his credentials from the United Methodist Church, and so only he can tell you how he will be credentialed after you disaffiliate if you choose to do so. Does that make sense? So that's why, and we're not wanting to limit conversation tonight, but you can imagine we could go for a long time if we don't sort of stay in our lane. And so I'm going to try to stay in my lane tonight and share with you what I know and how I can be helpful to you. But Pastor Scott and I have talked about how someone can be ready in the leadership team to take some notes so that during the question and answer time, we don't want it to be frustrating to you if we keep saying, wait till next week, wait till next week. We'll have someone ready to take some notes about that so that come next week, the leadership team will be ready to answer some of those questions. How does that sound? All right, let's get started. We're just going to do a few things tonight. Our next slide says what those are going to be. We're going to begin and end with prayer. I'm going to share with you some information, and I'm going to answer your questions. And we will keep our time together tonight with questions. I know people are passionate about the issues before us, but actually, I'm going to ask you to stick with questions tonight so we can get those answered. And now I'd love to invite you to pray with me. Holy and gracious God, we know that you are present here, and we're so grateful for that. Fill our hearts, our minds, our spirits, Lord. Help us to sense your joy in our own lives, in our homes, as well as in this place. And Lord, where there is worry tonight, where there is physical pain in this room, or pain in our hearts, or in our lives, or in our relationships, or in our families, Lord, where we feel stress, where we feel worry or anxiety, Lord, please fill us with your spirit of peace, and your spirit of hope, and your spirit of joy. Might that be on our hands and our hearts and our lips this evening. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's get started. Recent events that bring us to where we are. So why did we have over 25 district gatherings over the last month all throughout the state of Florida? Because there were a few things that happened in the month of March that led us to believe we should share some information with our congregations, our pastors, and our lay people. First, the General Conference has been postponed until 2024. There was meant to be a General Conference in 2020, in the month of May. That didn't happen, right? So that was postponed until a year later in 2021. That was postponed until this year, until August of this year, 2022. And in March, we received word that it would be postponed for 2 years until 2024. Remember, General Conference meets every 4 years. So we're going to forego 2020, and we're going to jump it to 2024, praying that all is well by then. Why was it going to be hard for us to have a General Conference in August of this year? It seems like we're doing a lot of things right now. Why couldn't we get that done? Well, remember, almost 40% of our delegates to General Conference come from other countries. Come from Africa, come from the Philippines, come from Europe. And vaccinations are not widespread yet around the world. And even harder than getting a vaccine, getting a visa to come to the United States. We have about 850 delegates. If 40% of them are from around the globe, it's going to be hard to make sure fairly we can get everybody here to be able to vote properly, right? So it would have been worse to plan for a General Conference, to get there, only to have half the room, or 20% or 30% or 40% of the room full of empty seats, right? Not able to participate. So why is the postponement of this particular General Conference significant? In May of 2020, we were to vote on legislation called a Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace Through Separation. A group of people in the United Methodist Church were wanting to leave the United Methodist Church, and a mediated agreement occurred called a protocol between and among people with varying positions on the issue of human sexuality in the life of the church. And the mediated agreement that was really made public in January of 2020 was called this protocol, and it was meant to be voted on in May of 2020. It would have allowed for churches and persons with a more conservative theology around human sexuality to leave the United Methodist Church in a particular way and with particular terms, okay? That can't be voted on until we meet in General Conference. Some people will say sometimes, well, can't we just act on the protocol even though just because we want it, even though it hasn't been voted on? Well, we actually can't. Many pieces of the protocol just can't be approved without General Conference action, okay? So we've been in this limbo. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what the concern is in just a minute to make sure we're all on the same page, okay? The Book of Discipline cannot change without a General Conference. Important to also remember, even in the midst of these recent events, the Book of Discipline hasn't changed. What does the Book of Discipline say about human sexuality? It says that all people are of sacred worth, that all people can be members of our congregations, that all people can be leaders in our congregations, regardless of their sexual orientation. That is what our Book of Discipline says. Our Book of Discipline prohibits, the language in the Book of Discipline is, a self-avowed practicing homosexual to be ordained. That is a restriction in our current Book of Discipline. And our Book of Discipline does not allow clergy to officiate same-sex weddings. And our Book of Discipline does not allow churches to open their churches to same-gender weddings, okay? So that's the current Book of Discipline, and that has not changed. And so you might ask, what was the protocol all about then? I'm kind of confused. So the Global Methodist Church launching on May the 1st is connected to number one. Number 1 and number 3 are connected. Those who are launching the Global Methodist Church, for the most part, are those who were a part of the agreement called the Protocol, a group of people who wanted to leave the United Methodist Church, assuming that one day the United Methodist Church would change its stance on those two things, marriage and ordination. Has the United Methodist Church changed its stance? No. The Book of Discipline cannot change without a General Conference. And actually, the protocol did not change the language. The protocol doesn't have anything to do with our language on human sexuality. The protocol is about churches leaving the United Methodist Church who want to leave because of this issue, okay? So even the protocol would not have changed our stance on marriage and ordination. Other legislation would have to be addressed. Other legislation would have to be put forward and would have to be approved for that to be the case, okay? So are all those things connecting for you? So what's on hold, this protocol? The other day I gave this presentation last week in Spanish, and we talked about, I said, what's a good image for this? It's like the protocol is sitting like right here. It's like on a table, and it's right here, but it's kind of sitting there right now, because nothing can really happen with this protocol until a General Conference, okay? When we do meet, in let's say 2024, will the protocol pass? We don't know. We don't know. It has to pass. Or it can be amended. All right? What are some portions of the protocol that might be helpful for you to know? Well, the protocol allows churches to leave in a slightly more advantageous manner than currently. All right? Just to be frank, it might be a little cheaper to leave if the protocol passes. But that's assuming the protocol doesn't get amended, right? It's assuming the protocol changes or doesn't change, changes in a particular way, right? It's still legislation that hasn't been acted on yet. The protocol is also meant to give a church, a denomination that might leave, a group of churches that might leave, financial resources. Again, it could be amended, it could be changed, hasn't been voted on yet, but those are some of the pieces. At the very end of this presentation, there are some websites, including one where you can read more about the protocol. We're not going to talk a lot about the protocol tonight. You know why? Because where is it sitting? It's kind of like right here, right? Okay. So what does all this mean for us? Well, right now it means your relationship to the United Methodist Church and to the Florida Conference doesn't change. So we've had some recent events that we just listed, but none of that changes your relationship to the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church. We continue to be the church together. Churches wishing to exit the denomination may consider disaffiliation. We're going to go through those slides a little bit later. If there's a paragraph, it's in the Book of Discipline, etc. And clergy wishing to withdraw from the denomination may also consider doing so. And this is where I always simply remind churches that, and laity, pastors, that we serve together for a season, right? Especially in the United Methodist Church. Sometimes it's a short season, sometimes it's a long season, right? A pastor and a congregation. But a pastor has a relationship to the superintendent, to the conference, that is different from the church's relationship to the superintendent and to the conference. That's why when a pastor moves, a superintendent represents the pastor, but also represents the church, right? Because we want to have a good fit for the pastor who's leaving your church and where they're going, and we want to have a good fit for you when you receive a new pastor. So pastors and churches do not go hand in hand, right? They have separate relationships. It is possible that in this season, in the life of our church, whether it be the next year or the next 4 years or the next 8 years, that pastors will make certain decisions about staying in the United Methodist Church or leaving the United Methodist Church, and that churches will make certain decisions about staying in the United Methodist Church or leaving the United Methodist Church. And those are different decisions. Those don't necessarily go together. And we will care for pastors and care for churches in this season, both in the ways that we should. Next. So, tonight you're going to hear me talk about why it's important for me that the United Methodist Church continue, and what I see. I mean, yes, I personally, but also, as I said earlier, I'm here representing the Florida Conference tonight, right? I'm here representing our leadership, our values. And so you'll hear me speaking from a personal perspective as well as from the conference perspective. And I want you to hear why I'm excited about the United Methodist Church and why I think we can live together in the United Methodist Church. In a little bit, I'll also be talking about the disaffiliation process, because that's my job with you too, is to make sure you have the information you need about that. But although we'll be talking about the possibility of leaving, I want you to know that my hope is that all churches will stay. I think it's important for you to hear that from me. I believe that there is a spiritual home. We'll see this quote in just a minute. A spiritual home for all people in the United Methodist Church. So we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight. So what's the first reason why I think churches can remain and should remain in the United Methodist Church? Well, because the current Book of Discipline is still in effect. And the vital work of your church has not been postponed, even among a lot of things being postponed. The work of your church and the vital work in your community hasn't changed. The Book of Discipline hasn't changed. There isn't anything dramatic that's happened in the last month or 2 or 3 or 5 that necessitates a change for us. So that is one. I know the good people of our communities need us to continue to do the good work in our communities. The next reason, the theological core of Methodism has not changed. Sometimes I'll see, not in any official capacity, but I'll see things posted, I'll see things written that seem to imply that in the future United Methodist Church, we will not be a church that is Bible-believing or that believes in salvation through Jesus, right? So claims like this are simply false, right? In the United Methodist Church, at the very beginning of the Book of Discipline, you have what's called the Constitution. So I like the word Constitution. To me, it's like DNA, right? Like I have my Constitution, my DNA, and it's really hard to change that, isn't it? In fact, it'd be easier to start something new with new DNA than it would be to change the DNA of a person, right? Or change the constitution of an entity. So our Constitution as United Methodists is that we believe in Scripture. Is that we believe in salvation through Jesus. We believe in the resurrection. We believe in the virgin birth. We believe in those primary tenets of our faith. Those aren't going anywhere. Those aren't changing. And we have a list of some of those here. You can look at them with me. You know them well. The doctrinal standards are clear. The triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the lordship of Christ, the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, And we believe that Scripture contains all things necessary for salvation, right? Our core, our constitution, our DNA. There's some other pieces of this good work that we believe in as well. To the next slide. Our common core, the Apostles' and Nicene Creeds. Perhaps we all learned the Apostles' Creed in confirmation class. The Articles of Religion, the Confession of Faith, the General Rules of Wesley. One primary rule being to do no harm. The Wesley hymns. Disciplined engagement with Scripture, works of piety and mercy and justice. I know your church is so good at that. Two sacraments, baptism and communion. Small group accountability and support. The list goes on. Your church could make a list a mile long about things that hold us together as a church community and our common core as Methodists. Next. As I said before, I like this quote. You'll sometimes hear Bishop Carter say this. The continuing United Methodist Church will be a spiritual home for all people. And there's a quote from an article, it's about a page and a half, called A Narrative for the Continuing United Methodist Church. So why do we call it the Continuing United Methodist Church? Well, there was a time before the protocol back in between about 2016 to 2019, in a very tense time in the life of the church, when lots of people had lots of different ideas about what we could do in the church, what we could do with the church. Some of those ideas were, let's just destroy the whole thing and start over. And people can pick this side or that side. That's kind of hard to hear. But ideas like that were proposed. Nobody gets to be the United Methodist Church. Everybody has to start from scratch. So ultimately, even before the protocol, certainly with the protocol, it became very clear that there would be a continuing United Methodist Church, that there would be a continuing presence in our conference, in our communities, etc. So sometimes that's why you see that language. Like, what does that mean, the continuing United Methodist Church? Well, there may be a group of people that leave the United Methodist Church, and there will be a continuing United Methodist Church. Okay, so this narrative here from the Council of Bishops. All our members, clergy, local churches at annual conferences will continue to have a home in the future United Methodist Church. Whether they consider themselves liberal, evangelical, progressive, traditionalist, middle of the road, conservative, centrist, or something else. And I've thought about these quotes a bit over this last little bit here as we've been preparing for these presentations. And some might say, a spiritual home for all people, is that really realistic? I mean, can a church be a spiritual home for all people? And my response, my resounding response to that is, yes, I believe we can. And guess why? Because we are. We're all in this room together tonight. And if we sat here and took a poll, we would have so many differences among us in all kinds of things. Perhaps, maybe even in some of the things that were just on that list. Maybe we don't all exactly agree on all the tenets of the faith, but we agree on most of those key core tenets. And we probably disagree on a lot of other things that probably don't matter so much. Maybe you'd rather have an early service, someone else would have a late service, a contemporary service, a traditional service. There are all kinds of differences we can have. But for a long time, the Methodist Church has been a spiritual home for all people. So I believe we can be that church because I believe we are that church. I encounter that difference all the time as I experience it with churches, and I see people working together smoothly in such helpful ways. So recently, in one of our gatherings, someone stood up with a question and said, "You say there are differences in the church that are significant. Give me an example of one." I said, "Okay, I will." So imagine I arrive at a church and I'm the new pastor. And someone comes up to me and says, "Welcome, Pastor. I'm not happy you're here." You can laugh, it's okay. Has that happened to me? Absolutely. Almost every church I've gone to. "Welcome, Pastor. I'm not happy you're here. I don't believe women should be pastors." But guess what? Almost every time we serve together, we love together, we work together, we study together. Now, after I've been there 5 or 6 years, have I changed that person's mind? Actually, not always. Sometimes that happens, but not always. It's not my job to change their mind. What's my job? To serve them. My job is to serve them and to serve the Lord. And what's their job? To serve the Lord and to work with their pastor. And guess what? Usually they do pretty well. That's not a little difference. Like believing a woman should be a pastor or not, that's actually kind of a big difference. In my life, it like changed my whole life, right? If I didn't believe from the time I was 6 or 8 or 10 or however old I was that I could be a pastor. But I know for a fact that I can walk alongside someone who disagrees with that pretty fundamental tenet in the United Methodist Church. We've been ordaining women since 1956, kind of a long time, almost 70 years. So it's not a little thing in our church. It's a pretty important thing. But there's a person who says, I'm going to go to a United Methodist Church, even though I don't believe in this one thing, and I love my local church, and I'm even going to receive a female pastor, and I'm going to walk alongside her, even though I may not believe in her leadership. But I'm going to do my role, and she'll do her role, and we'll work together. And minds may never be changed. But we've done, I believe, what we've been called to do, to serve God. And frankly, also to serve each other. Because my job is also to serve that person, and her job is also to walk alongside her pastor faithfully. Right? So I've seen it happen. I've seen us live with some pretty big differences and still serve the Lord very well. So I'm pretty convinced that it can continue happening. Next slide. So there's a hashtag called BUMC, and if you go to umc.org, our United Methodist Church website, you can find BUMC, and there's videos and testimonials and all kinds of interesting things that people have posted about what it means to be UMC. And I would just invite you tonight to think in your own life. If you had to, so you know when you're a little kid and they say, draw a picture that represents, so what if I said, draw a picture that represents your experience in the United Methodist Church? What would you draw? You know, would it have like a person on it or a bunch of people or a Sunday school class or choir? Would it be this sanctuary? Would it be Bible school? You know, what do you think of when you think BUMC? You know, a lot of things come to mind for me in this district, having served here as a pastor and as a superintendent. And one that will always stand out to me happened a long time ago, but it has impacted indirectly my life and ministry here. So who took Disciple Bible Study when it was so popular? Disciple Bible Study, yep. Very intensive program. That was not for kidding, right? It was a lot of reading, a lot of studying. Disciple Bible Study was serious. So at the First United Methodist Church of Coral Gables, Disciple Bible Study, there was a couple in the class, and the gentleman was Alva Chapman. He was a very well-known publisher. He owned the company that published the Miami Herald at that time. And he and his wife were in the disciple class, and they went through the whole class through the year. And what's the question that comes at the very end of Disciple Bible Study? What are you going to do? So you read the whole Bible in a year, you studied the Bible, you met with your group every week. What are you going to do? Well, he felt the Lord say to him, you need to solve homelessness in Miami. Just a little thing. Just a small, tiny thing. But guess what he did? Almost single-handedly solved homelessness in Miami. In Los Angeles, on any given night, there's 10,000 people living on the street. In Miami, there's less than 900. We have a wonderful homeless shelter called Chapman Partnership for the Homeless. Among others, Camilla's House, which is Catholic, and other organizations. Alva Chapman said, I know a lot of people who have a lot of resources. And I'm going to tell them to pony up. I'm going to get them together. We're going to learn about homelessness in Miami. We're going to learn what people need. We're going to build a state-of-the-art facility for men, for women, for children, for families. The Miami Heat, there's a beautiful room at Chapman for children that's got Miami Heat stuff everywhere. They sponsor the room. They've got the basketball courts outside that Dwayne Wayne helped to install himself. It's a community effort to get people off the street, to find jobs, to get health care, etc. I love that story. To me, that's what it's about to be United Methodist, because you're at a Bible study in a United Methodist church every week for a whole year, and then guess what? You do something about it. That's very Wesleyan, isn't it? That's very John Wesley. Do something about it. So I would invite you to consider what it means to be UMC. So a couple of interesting quotes here. You don't often see Pope Francis and Andy Stanley on the same page. So if you don't know who Andy Stanley is, he's really an evangelist, a preacher in Georgia, in Atlanta, at a large church. He spoke about a month ago to the Georgia legislature, and this is what he said to them. Disagreement is unavoidable. Division is always a choice. Not bad to say to politicians, but we might say not a bad thing to say to church people too, right? And then Pope Francis, sorry about that, go back, Pope Francis, the only future worth building includes everyone. What does it mean to think about including everyone in the life of the church and being a home for everyone? Some scripture passages that are, I'm sure you've got your long list of scripture passages that are important to you too, but I think this particularly for this moment in the life of the church. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Therefore welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. So to remain United Methodist, there is no vote needed, and you don't need to do anything. Someone earlier was saying, keep this really simple. So that's pretty simple, right? That there's a continuing United Methodist Church. We continue to be the United Methodist Church in the Florida Conference, and there's a way for people to continue to live together in that. At the General Conference in 2024, we'll be hearing all kinds of legislation, I'm sure, and there'll be a General Conference every 4 years after that. Might the language in our Book of Discipline around same-gender weddings and ordination of gay and lesbian persons change? Might it change? Of course it might change. Of course it might change. Has it changed? It hasn't changed yet. Might it change in 2024? I do not know. Do I believe there is room in the United Methodist Church for all people, even those who disagree with that stance? I believe there is. In part because as a superintendent, I've been able to work with so many churches who are all very different in how they see the world and what they believe is needed in their context for ministry. So when I meet with your staff parish, when there might be a pastoral change, or when I meet with a church in Dade County or up in Delray, I try to listen. Part of our consultation process is to listen. Who could serve your church well in your context, in your community? And that won't change. I hope I did a good job when I sent Pastor Scott to you. I felt like I did. I felt like it was a really good fit for your church. Really. I felt like I understood the context of your church, what your hopes and dreams were, and your theological leanings. And I felt that I knew Scott pretty well because he and I had gotten to know each other pretty well. I don't think that will change in the future. I think superintendents will continue to do a really good job of listening in that consultation time, right, around the diversity in our church. And we have already said as a cabinet that should the position in the United Methodist Church change on churches being able to host same-gender weddings, that we will allow for churches to choose not to do that. Guess why? Because in the Book of Discipline it says you get to decide how to use your building. It already says that, right? So if a church is not yet comfortable hosting same-gender weddings, even if the Book of Discipline changes, you'll be allowed to do that. And we will try to honor the ways that we choose to live together in community in our context, right? I do believe we can all live together as United Methodists in South Florida, in Florida, and in and around our country, in the world. Okay, we're going to move on to the slides about disaffiliation, and then we're going to take some questions. How does that sound? So what is disaffiliation and why are we talking about it? Well, we're cut to the chase here at Davie. We're talking about it because you sent me a letter, right? Because your church council sent me a letter and said, we are considering disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church. We want to begin that process. So part of the process is me coming to talk to you tonight. We've been through this, right? We also have been sharing this information with other churches because we want people to have accurate information. We are learning that people don't have accurate information. We want you to have it. And this information is straight from our Book of Discipline in paragraph 2553, okay? Of course, to be clear, we're not asking anyone to disaffiliate. As I said tonight, we want people to remain in the United Methodist Church because we believe there's a spiritual home for all people here. But we want you to be informed. General Conference discerns our next steps. There's likely no need to have this conversation about disaffiliation, at least for most churches. Davie is the only church in the district at this time that is asking to talk about disaffiliations. I've got all the time in the world to talk to you because we're not having this conversation at other churches. But as we approach 2024, et cetera, there may be more interest in talking. We want to do this in a relationship, and obviously part of my job is to do this with you and have this conversation with you, and I'm happy to be here. We want to treat churches fairly and with dignity, and I hope you feel I'm doing that, and I hope that we'll do that for each other. In 2021, 3 churches disaffiliated from the Florida Conference. There's about 600 total churches. And this year in 2022, we have about 15 churches considering disaffiliation. Next slide. So there's a paragraph called 2553. Your leaders are aware of this because they even referenced it in the letter to me. This is good. They've done some homework about this. It just lists what's necessary to withdraw from the denomination, to disaffiliate. We're here tonight having an information meeting. You'll have another one next week about possible future, the future for you should you disaffiliate. 2553 is a paragraph that is for churches wanting to disaffiliate based on the issue of human sexuality, okay, for that reason, different from other reasons. So, just so we're clear, a church conference, so what's a church conference? A church conference is when your council members are the voting members. That's all. A church conference is when every member is a voting member. So what's required to disaffiliate is a church conference, so every member of the church can vote, and it must pass by 2/3, okay? So some ask about the voting threshold. Well, why 2/3? Why not a simple majority, for example? You haven't asked that, but some people ask that. Well, I give this example. So let's say your church, like let's say tonight we were having a church conference and we were going to vote on a loan. Like maybe you've had church conferences before where you were needing to vote on something like a loan or selling a piece of property. So even though it's only required a simple majority to do that, to get, let's say, $200,000 in a loan to fix your roof, right, to fix repairs, et cetera, fix your parsonage. Even if it passed by 51%, I wouldn't sign off on that loan for your church, which I have to do. Why wouldn't I? Can you pay back $200,000 with only 51% of your people? Probably not, right? You need everybody to be on board with that loan. You need everybody to be excited about the roof repair and the parsonage repairs to be able to do that faithful work. I would have questions about if you're ready to do that, if you didn't have enough people. So it's the same with this, right? If your church wants to leave the denomination, leave strong. I'm not kidding, leave strong. Because I don't know that any church can actually sustain itself if only 51% of the people stay and 49% leave to go to other churches. That's a much diminished church, right? So I think it's in your best interest, it's in all of our best interest for there to be a higher threshold. I mean, 2/3 is what it is. It's what it says in the paragraph 2553. But I like to share that as a rationale because to me it seems like it makes sense. Like you would want 2/3 of your folks to make a strong decision one way or the other, to stay in the United Methodist Church or to leave the United Methodist Church, okay? And it does require the approval of the annual conference session. So when a church votes to disaffiliate, if they receive the 2/3 of the vote threshold, then it would go to the annual conference for our session. All right? The next one is financial requirements. And what I did is I added With Scott's help, I added the Davie numbers to this slide just so you have it. Like, this will also be discussed next week on May 3rd, but since we have the information, so you have to pay any of your unpaid apportionments for this year. Well, your number is 0 because Davie has already paid its apportionments for 2022. Hooray, right? A very faithful thing to do. You need to pay an additional 12 months of apportionments. What's that number? $27,645. We're going to go through the numbers, and then I'm going to give you a little of explanation in just a minute. That's your number, $27,645. Payment of an amount equal to the local church's pro rata share of the annual conference's unfunded pension obligations as determined by the annual conference. Like I said, I'm going to explain this in a minute. That number is $148,902. Next Tuesday night, your leaders will share with you how those amounts will get paid. All right, that's part of their role in sharing with you a plan for disaffiliation. But those are the numbers. And I appreciate you getting those to me, Scott, this week. And payment of unpaid pension or salary or ministry protection, that's 0. Your ministry protection has been paid through June 30th of this year, which is what's required at this moment. And payment of any legal costs. Now, I want to mention this one. Sometimes people say, you better get a lawyer. I'm free, and so is the Book of Discipline. You don't need a lawyer, right? To disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, we have a Book of Discipline, and you have my time, and part of my job is to walk through this process with you. Eventually, if you vote to disaffiliate and you need to incorporate, right? You need to incorporate as a church that's not United Methodist. You need to change your name. You need to do a variety of things. Sure, you might want an attorney to look over your paperwork. That might be smart. That's not too big of a deal. And of course, you'd need to pay for that. But you do not need an attorney to sort of help make this happen for you, right? I'm here. The Book of Discipline is here. The conference has set up all of this stuff in order for us to do this in an amicable way should we choose to do that, all right? There is a checklist. It's about 3 pages long, not 5 items long, but here's a few things like I just mentioned. Obviously, you would continue without the United Methodist name. You would need to change your name and new tax ID numbers, and you need to turn over your archives to the United Methodist Church. You need new insurance, and next week they will have insurance numbers for you for how much insurance will cost for the building, because that comes through the conference, as you know. You do need to provide indemnity to the annual conference, et cetera. So there's all these things on the checklist. Your leaders have that. They're being very diligent about those matters. So one quick thing about the financial matters from before. So the image I use is this. The United Methodist Church is a connectional church. Some of you over the years may perhaps have found that frustrating, that we're connected to each other. Some of you perhaps have experienced the benefit of being connected to other churches. But whether you like it or not, the United Methodist Church is a connectional church. Other churches around your community don't function that way. They probably own their property outright. They probably call their pastor in the way that they want to. They probably make decisions about their building or their ministries however they want to, and they don't have to deal with someone like Lakeland, right? Well, guess what? That's not our church. We're a connectional church. We are very connected to each other. And so if we are becoming disconnected, disaffiliation is a way of disconnecting. And so in order to not do harm, it takes a while to do that, and there is some financial obligation to that. So for example, the apportionments that we ask to be paid, and this is in paragraph 2553, it's in the discipline, that you would pay 1 extra year of apportionments. Well, imagine the commitments we've made for 2023 already. We've made commitments to Africa University. We've made commitments to salaries of people who work in our Lakeland office, right? We help missionary support. So to cut those cords too soon and very quickly could do harm to a lot of things. So part of the reason why this is in the paragraph in the Book of Discipline is because it's a gradual approach to caring for the connection by someone who's ready to leave the connection, okay? And the part about the pension liability, which can feel like a high number, is that in the United Methodist Church, for many general conferences, we have approved very generous pension plans for our clergy. It's just the way it is. And we have a long, what they sometimes say, a long tail of clergy benefits for clergy and their spouses through our pension program, all right? Is our pension program funded? Of course it's funded. However, we have pensions that we will owe for the next 50, 60, 70 years, right? If you think about the people first coming into ministry now, as long as they'll be in ministry and their spouses, right? Because our pension program has been quite generous over the years. And so there's a way in which we want to care for all the pastors who have served your church, all the spouses of the pastors who have served your church, and beyond. And so there's a formula for caring for that, okay? I don't think any of us, in fact, some churches have made the news recently about pension funds not being, the obligations not being able to be met for clergy. So we don't want to be a part of anything like that, where there would be clergy or spouses that would not have their pensions paid because we're having a squabble in the United Methodist Church today, right? And so those are those financial pieces, all right? As I mentioned earlier, in all scenarios, there will be a continuing United Methodist Church. So it seems imperative during this season of waiting and prayer and discernment that we reflect on the strengths of our church and our hopes for the future. And so our hope, the Florida Conference's hope for our churches during this season, is to enter into this season of tension and challenge and opportunity with patience, with a spirit of humility about what God might do, and to embrace individual responsibility and discernment in terms of how our own relationship with God, our own feelings about the issues before us, our relationship to our churches, our relationship to our conference, all right? And so how can you help to prepare your church during this time? Be intentional, build relationships, highlight the important ministries of your church, go slowly, have multiple conversations. And what we are telling churches is there's really no rush, that General Conference 2024 is at a distance, and there's much work to be done now. In Florida, we will walk with you, as I hope you're seeing that we are doing now in this season with Davie. We'll respond appropriately and timely to your questions. We'll guard the unity of the church. We know that some may depart, and we'll treat these persons and churches with respect and dignity, and we'll follow the discipline. And we'll continue to highlight ways to be in ministry together by creating pathways to the post-COVID church. All right. I think we have our question fella back here in the back with a microphone. So you've heard a lot of information. Perhaps some of your questions have already been answered. That would be great. If there are lingering questions that I can help you answer tonight, I am happy to do that. There's one right here.
Before we begin, how would you like us
to address me?
Yes.
Oh, Cynthia. Yeah, thank you. No, Cindy, preferably, but Cynthia. my little 4-year-old niece, she's Cindy.
Okay, Cynthia. Hi, how are you?
Yes.
The question I have is, if I wanted to remain a Methodist,
yes,
and not, if for some reason the disaffiliation
yeah,
church, and I choose not to stay, if I wanted to remain a Methodist, what are my options? What do I do?
Very good question. And Pastor Scott and I have actually already talked about this, because we talked about the need, and he's in full agreement, for a pastor is a pastor to all people, including when I was a pastor to a person who didn't believe that I should be a pastor, right? Like, that's part of our call, is to shepherd our flock. And so actually, you can probably imagine a couple of scenarios over these next few weeks as you have known each other a long time, and you have lived and worked and loved together in this church a long time. A vote to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church will bring support and joy for some of you perhaps, and grieving for others. And if there is a vote that does not approve disaffiliation, there will be some people upset by that and other people relieved by that, right? So no matter what, there is going to be the need for deep prayer and the need for great sensitivity and thoughtfulness among all of you, right? That's just going to be a fact of the next month or so in your church or beyond. And so Pastor Scott and I have talked about how part of his role in walking with you, for example, should the church approve disaffiliation, walking with the members who would like to find a new United Methodist Church that would be their home, right? Now, many of you may be familiar with United Methodist churches that are nearby. Some of you may be less familiar. And so that could be part of my role. It could be Pastor Scott's role. He's been in this district for some time as well. So trying to help you connect to a new church home, find a new church home, etc. It might not be unlike when one of you might say you're moving to Tampa, and your pastor might get on the phone and call a friend or say, hey, like I have a friend, I have a church member moving to Tampa, looking for a church home. We might want to come at it with that spirit, right? With that spirit. I want to help this person find a new home. And this is not about winning and losing. It's not about, all of us have our own relationships with the Lord and with this church and with one another. And so we are going to want to respect people in their space and in their decision making. So I can be a resource, Pastor Scott, or others. That's a very good question. Mm-hmm. Other questions? What up here? How are you? I'm picturing people in committee meetings over the years with me. I'm like, she always sat in that seat, in that room.
Hello, good evening. So, I was in the present at the 2019, and I wrote myself a note because I might get nervous saying what I want to say, and I don't want to forget the words.
It's okay.
So, and it was very uncomfortable for me that year. Very insecure. I felt very insecure being there.
You're talking about annual conference 2019 in
conference.
Lakeland. Yes,
Correct.
Thank you.
There was many people there that were wearing T-shirts that said things that were not, according to me, that weren't church-like. Things that should have been said. That was my opinion. There was a lot of things that went on that day or that weekend that were very made me feel very insecure about a lot of things. It wasn't right according to what I knew about the church. But also there was the voting that went on. And that's what I want to make sure I say that correct. But there was, sorry. That's why I wrote it down. In the voting for the delegates, there was a lot of, I took part in the voting because I was there for Clergy that year. So, you, as a major leader of our church, received many votes. You were like chosen by just about everybody. I think it was a major vote for you, which is great, but because of it, I was under the impression that, that to me, that was like a broken church right there. All these people fighting each other or arguing with each other. I was approached several times, and I didn't care for that situation.
Yeah. Yep.
So what are we going to do about that?
Yeah. That's so let me give a little context for folks. So this would have been June of 2019 in Lakeland, after what had been a special session of the General Conference. So the General Conference meets every 4 years, except in 2016, because we left Portland, Oregon, with no resolution to the issues before us around human sexuality and what many called an impasse. The bishops called for a special session of the General Conference to meet in 2019 to only discuss this matter. We met in St. Louis. So who's we? So I would have been there because, as was shared, clergy are elected as delegates, lay people are elected as delegates, Florida gets a certain number, to go and represent. So in 2019 in St. Louis, what was known as the traditional plan did pass in St. Louis. The traditional plan, it feels like a really long time ago now, wow, but it was, it made our book of discipline more punitive for bishops and for clergy around issues of human sexuality, suspensions. That was really the word that kept being used to describe it, very punitive. Not a very grace-filled, for many of us we felt, not a very grace-filled response to where we were in the life of the church. And immediately following St. Louis, there was really a reaction. Part of the reaction were newspaper ads around the country in many cities where United Methodists were saying, this isn't our church, because the news was reporting accurately that the actions taken by the General Conference were very sharp in relation to gay and lesbian persons. So many churches felt, lay people came together in many different cities around the nation and took out full-page ads in the Sunday paper, which those aren't cheap, you know, saying like, you belong here, this is our church. So I'm just describing what happened. There was a reaction to the events of 2019 in St. Louis. And in Lakeland, in June of 2019, there was another reaction. That's what I would call that. And that happened in many annual conferences around the nation. And I think I would describe that as when one very extreme thing happens, sometimes a pendulum swings and another very extreme thing happens as a reaction to what felt very punitive and felt like not a representation of the church in the United States for some people. You know, for many people, the issue around human sexuality is a justice issue. It's not that for everyone. But sometimes that helps people to see it with a slightly different lens, right? So I've been asked, are there gay and lesbian pastors in the United Methodist Church? Yes, there are. So somebody might say, well, how is that even possible? I mean, the Book of Discipline says that can't happen. Well, for people over many decades who believe this is an issue of justice, and again, all people do not see it that way. But for people who do, you know, the Bible does say certain things about matters of justice. And there are even places where people are encouraged to break policy or law for matters of justice. Again, I'm simply describing how some people view the issue of human sexuality and marriage and ordination, okay? So when I was growing up in Kansas City, I had a pastor who was gay. This is in the 1980s. My first district superintendent in another conference in Kansas was gay. So you might say, like, that's so strange to me. Like, I don't understand how that could happen in the United Methodist Church where our Book of Discipline says things occur in a certain way. But I would say to you, for some time, people have felt that as a matter of justice, when a person feels called to serve the Lord in ordained ministry, that should be affirmed, okay? So that's sort of the how. That's the, like, how does that happen? Well, that would be the how. So again, everyone does not see it this way. But when segregation in our country was legal, when it was legal, for persons who felt that segregation was unjust, often they broke policies or broke laws because they felt it was an issue of justice. Racial segregation was an issue of justice. Right? Again, not everyone views this in that way. But in order for you to see how many different people are living in the life of the United Methodist Church right now, that's a piece of that. So, to your point, I think a lot of 2019 was a reaction. I think St. Louis was an extreme conservative reaction to what was happening in the church, and I think some of the annual conference experiences that summer were an extreme, more progressive reaction to that, right? So kind of a pendulum here and there. And probably regrettable things happened on both sides, words shared, actions, etc., because of that extreme time. And it's, I think for many of us who were a part of some of that, you know, to end that year, to begin the next year with the protocol, so that's what led to the protocol. I mean, those extreme situations in annual conferences are exactly what led conservative folks and progressive folks in the United Methodist Church to say, we need to sit down at a table together. And the protocol was mediated by a professional mediator, like actually a world-famous mediator, Ken Feinberg. He pro bono gave his time to the United Methodist Church to mediate our disagreement. And what came out of that was the protocol. And I think the protocol came about precisely because of what you described. Wow, this is an extreme, and this is an extreme, and what is happening in the life of the church? Yeah. So I think we are still living. We're still living with a lot of that, and I hope we learn how to continue to live better with each other. Yeah, but thank you for sharing that.
So do you think the protocol is going to pass in 2024?
Good question. Do I think the protocol is going to pass in 2024, and do I personally support it? You know, I don't know. I think so we're in almost May, so 2 years from now, May of 24. I think it's probably likely that the protocol will be submitted as legislation again, either with some revisions or there will be some amendments made. So one person described it as this. So the protocol became public in January of 2020, and we were meant to vote on it in May of 2020. That's 5 months. So some people who actually worked on it have said it was meant to live for 5 months. But now it's been 2 years. So what happens when something's been sitting here for 2 years? What are people doing to it? They're like picking it apart, right? I don't like that, I don't like that, we could do that differently. Now the whole point of a mediation is that you don't do a lot of that, right? That the people in the room worked really hard to craft something everyone could agree to. But 5 months may have been its shelf life, right? So I think with time comes different perspectives, and we've had a pandemic. So I do think it's likely amendments will be made, in which case, no matter what I say now about supporting it or not, you know, who knows what might happen with some amendments. I am, in a general way, in agreement with us finding a way to end our impasse as a denomination. I mean, my whole life, the language came into the Book of Discipline the year I was born in 1972. So literally my whole life, we've been fighting about this. So that's not very pleasant, you know, when I think about the long years of ministry. So I am in agreement with us finding a way to help people live together. And you mentioned my election to the delegation, et cetera. It's only fair for me to share with you too that I do support a change in our language around marriage and ordination. That is I support that in our church. And I share that openly, and I also believe we can all live together, even people who disagree with me and disagree in the church about that. But I do believe we can find a way for everyone to find room to breathe in the midst of this.
Wait 1 second, please.
Okay.
Don't shout out questions. Please get the microphone because the microphone feeds into the live stream, and if you shout a question out, the people on the live stream can't hear you.
Makes sense.
So please wait for that. Thank you.
So we had talked about the votes. So all those people in 2019 that were voted to be our representatives have been our representatives all this time, and they're going to continue being our representatives through 24.
We have yet to find out with full confirmation that that's the case. We do believe if 2024 is considered a postponed general conference, then yes, the people who were elected to go to 2020 will be the ones going to 2024. If it is determined that 2024 is a new general conference, there will need to be new delegates. So actually, we're not 100% yet on that.
Don't we have to vote for that?
No, it's really more a matter of how, I mean, as you can imagine, our book of discipline does not mention a pandemic, right? It doesn't say, if there's a pandemic, this is what you're going to do. And so our judicial council, you know, the people in the church whose jobs are to know our polity, we call it, it's really their job to determine how to handle those matters. So we're waiting for full verification of that. Annual conferences will not decide that.
I'm sorry about that. My last question really is regarding why did we put it off till 24? Why didn't we do like a Zoom thing from?
Well, remember.
I mean, we do it for everything else.
Right. Well, remember, many of our delegates live in villages in Africa with no Wi-Fi. So there's no Zoom.
Come on.
So, well, no, I'm talking hundreds of delegates come from around the world. So I tell you, my thought, this was in the fall of 2020. In the fall of 2020, I said out loud, we need to assume we are not going to have an in-person general conference anytime soon, and we need to go ahead and start spending the money that we would have spent flying people to stay in hotels. We need to spend that money at Africa University. We need to build a hub of Wi-Fi channels so that people can go to the hub, and we need to build a hub in the Philippines, and we need to build a hub so that we're building infrastructure for an online community. It didn't happen. But I thought that to myself, like, this is not going to happen anytime soon. It's very complicated. Okay, more questions. Over here.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi.
Thanks for coming, first off,
Thanks.
and bless you.
Good to be here.
I'm sort of in the middle of everything. I'm not progressive. I'm not traditionalist, but I believe everybody should be welcome here. My question is, why, if we have a book of disciplines, do we not follow it? Because me as a United Methodist, if I don't like the covenant that I gave to the church, then why wouldn't I go to a church that would meet needs, and I could give my covenant to God and the church with a true heart? I mean, I gave it, I accepted it, that we had restrictions. Didn't like it. I have been praying for 5 years, and I will continue to pray. But I stand by the book of disciplines. That was what I gave my covenant to. So that's where my conflict is. So maybe you can help me out there.
So I think I would simply elaborate again on this issue of justice, that for people who feel like our restrictions on gay and lesbian leadership in ordained ministry and in marriage are issues of justice, I think that's where people who are in positions of leadership to make decisions contrary to the book of discipline would come down on. No particular desire to break rules or make a mess, but someone, I mean, you all can imagine. I mean, a young person is raised in your church, baptized in your church, confirmed in your church, goes to college, feels a call to ministry, goes to seminary, right, and is gay, right? And so at some point along the line, there's a pastor, there's a superintendent, there's a district committee on ministry, there's a committee on ordained ministry, and those relationships with that person might make people choose to decide to approve that person in ministry. So everybody has a story. So I would simply say, this isn't just a black and white kind of like break the rule, not break the rule. There's relationships involved. The other thing I would say is, let me give you another example of something in the book of discipline that's actually broken a lot more often than issues of human sexuality. So are you aware that in the book of discipline, United Methodist clergy are not allowed to re-baptize people, period. If you've been baptized one time, that's it. Now, why do we believe that as United Methodists? Who does the stuff at baptism? Who's doing the work? God. So does God make mistakes? No. So if your child, grandchild, neighbor was baptized in a Catholic church, or in a Pentecostal church, or in a Methodist church, do we believe God was doing what God does? Yep. So that's why we don't believe in rebaptism. And it's in the book of discipline. Do I know pastors in this district who rebaptize? I do. I do. Do I believe they do it because they want to break the book of discipline? No. No. Typically, it's because they serve in a cultural situation where rebaptism is perhaps more common. Perhaps it's because they are working with a person that, now, you probably have had reaffirmations of baptism in your church, right? Where we put the sign of water on your forehead or on your hand. I love reaffirmation of baptism. We remember when we were maybe a baby and our grandparents surrounded us, our parents. We can't remember it, but we can see it, we can feel it. And so a pastor puts water on our forehead to remember our baptism. I could do that all day long. We could do that tonight if you want to, right? But that's not the same as rebaptizing. But do I trust that a pastor in our district who rebaptized someone is doing that for the right reason? Because in that moment or with that person or with that family, right? Do I believe there's going to be punishment for that? No. I don't believe God's going to punish them for that, nor do I think I should punish them for that as a district superintendent, although I could, because it's breaking the book of discipline, right? So there are places where I think our human relationships and the spirit within us to be drawn to people and to walk with people and to walk on their faith journey, leads us to make decisions at times that are for people. And I believe God understands that that's part of the world we live in. Maybe one more follow-up? Mm-hmm.
Then why aren't we, as United Methodists, working to change the book of discipline?
Oh, there are.
Okay, that's what I didn't know.
Yes,
That's
yes.
why I'm asking.
Yeah, there certainly are. Right. Yeah, there certainly are. Mm-hmm.
I have been in this church for 64 years. I have served on many committees. You mentioned that our obligations for 2022 are zero. As being on the Treasury Committee many times in the last 64 years, 63 years, I know that we didn't meet that obligation. And so, as I remember, most of those obligations were excused, that we would try to make it up next year, but if we didn't, well, that's okay too, okay? So my question is, it seems like that the obligation for us to leave the Methodist Church is a very heavy financial situation. What happens, as far as Methodism is concerned, if we don't pay those financial obligations that you say that we have to pay for the pensions and for the next year we got to pay for the all the fees and everything that we would have paid if we stayed. So what is the Methodist hire?
Yep. What
are they going to do? Are they going to sue us, or is that kind of we're sorry you can't make it? We'll excuse you.
Good question.
Have you heard anything on this?
Oh, of course. Yes, absolutely. So you're right that part of being connected to each other means when you're in hardship, and Davie United Methodist Church says we can only pay 60% of our apportionments this year, what happens? You're still United Methodist. We still go into the next year, right? We have a period of grace around that. There is grace in relationship to a majority of the apportionments. There are 2 in particular that that carry over every year. And that's part of being connected to each other. Now, if you disaffiliate, you will be disconnecting from the body. And so those financial numbers are related to your disconnection, right? That you'll be leaving the denomination, you will no longer be a part of our pool of obligations for the various things. So there's a cost for that. And actually those numbers, like the apportionment number for next year and the pension number, so you have to pay those before you can disaffiliate. So you said, what will happen if we don't? Well, if you don't, you won't disaffiliate, right? You'll still be a United Methodist Church. You will not be released from the trust clause, etc. So that's just part of paragraph 2553 in the Book of Discipline says, you need to do this and this and this and this if you want to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church with your church property. Now remember, in the United Methodist Church, churches never are allowed to leave with their church property. So that is actually part of 2553, and that's part of the protocol, which is very unusual in the United Methodist Church because our property is held in trust. Any day of the week, you can choose to leave, and you can take your people anywhere you want, right? But this church was built as a United Methodist Church, and it's held in trust with the Florida Conference. So part of the reason why paragraph 2553 is established the way it is, and part of what's written into the protocol, is that churches will agree to do this and this and this if they will be allowed to leave the denomination with their church property, okay? Because normally that would never be okay to leave with church property. It's just not a part of the United Methodist Church. Yes, one more, there's one behind you, and then, oh, sorry.
Clarification. Dick, were you asking why was the number 0 for this year?
It's because you already
we've
paid
already
it.
paid it.
You already paid it.
We don't owe any money because it's already been paid.
Does that make sense? Okay, so you don't think that was not your question, part of the 0? Okay, perfect, okay. But yes, it said your obligation for 2022 is 0 because you have paid it already. Not because you didn't have an obligation, but because you have paid it already. And if you hadn't paid it already, I would have put the number up there because that's part of it.
I thought his question is being,
Wait.
all right. I just want to
I have a lady here who has,
Wait, I'll repeat it. Hold on, I'll repeat it.
then it doesn't help with streaming, man. It doesn't help with streaming.
Rick, it's okay. It's okay. She's got it.
Okay, right. So that I thought I addressed that at the beginning. So he did say, if in the United, he remembers that there have been years. Did he go? Oh, that there have been years when, like, Davie could not pay in full, and I remember those years too, right? When Davie was able to pay 54% of your apportionments or 61% of your apportionments. So he did say he remembered that happening, and there was some grace around that, which is true. So my description of that was part of us being connected to each other is that we celebrate with each other when we get 100%, and we've celebrated the last few years, haven't we? We've celebrated that Davie has paid 100% of their apportionments. And when we aren't able to pay 100%, we also understand. We understand and work with churches when they don't pay 100%. Yeah, Kathy.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Nolasco. I'm Paul and Sarah's youngest daughter. I was baptized and confirmed here. I know many of you. And I was married here, and this is where I received my call to ministry. And I've been a pastor at Plantation United Methodist for 14 years now. Growing up, this church was always so welcoming and a warm and loving community. And I want to say thank you for the example that you gave me as to what it means to follow Christ and what it means to be a church that welcomes all. And I will continue to be in the United Methodist Church, and that's very important to me. And it's important to me that we are a church for all people, regardless of if you agree on all things or not. So I just want to encourage you all. Thank you for being that example, and I really, really, really hope that you will seriously consider continuing to be that example into the future. I do have a question. My question is this. If on May 15th you all vote to, as I can't vote, I'm a member of the conference, not a member of any particular church. If you all vote to choose to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, I know you've talked about possibly going independent for some time. Can you then choose, and after 6 months or a year or 2 years, to re-affiliate with the United Methodist Church?
Well, I have not gotten that question before. Let's see. So if you choose to disaffiliate, could you re-affiliate next year or in 5 years? I mean, I don't think there's any reason for me to say no. I think we would, sure, I'm sure there is a way for a church to re-affiliate. You would need to reincorporate, right? And begin to use the United Methodist Church's name again. And I'm sure all kinds of other things, including probably a 2/3 majority vote of your congregation that says, we want to do this, and this is why. You know, something's happened that's made us want to come back into the United Methodist Church. I know that this will be covered, next week when you talk, but I'm from the state of Mississippi originally, and so for various reasons over the years, churches have disaffiliated from the conference, not necessarily due to this issue, but others. And one thing that's happened over time is, churches, one set of questions you might ask going into next week's meeting is, so when do we normally call the conference, and if we disaffiliate, who would we call? Does that make sense? Like, if our pastor leaves, we call who? Me, right? And I come meet with your staff parish, and I say, we'll have you a pastor. Like July 1st, we'll have you a new pastor. So you would want to think about, so how would we, if something happens to Pastor Scott, if Pastor Scott leaves, what was that? Then, like, how would we, if we were an independent church, like, how would we go about, calling a new pastor? Like, what would that look like? Normally, we'd call the district office. If someone sues us, right? Normally, you call Lakeland if you get a letter in the mail from a lawyer. So, like, who would we call? If a hurricane comes through, like, who would we call? So, I think those are some important things in the life of the church for you to think about, and I think that will help in your discernment. That'll help in your discernment. Sort of, how comfortable are we with this new image of how we'll function together? Yep. And maybe that would help to avoid the possibility that we're going to make a decision that we'd later want to reverse. Yep. But good question. It's always good to get a question for the first time. Yes. Oop. There we go. Oop. One more time.
Any plans for ordination of gay pastors prior to 2024, or as far as you know, intentions of them being?
Generally speaking, in our denomination, well, boards of ordained ministry do the work of examining candidates for ministry. So every conference has a board of ordained ministry. The candidates for ministry that are approved by the board come to what's called the clergy session of the annual conference, which is the first day of annual conference, to be approved. If they're approved there, they're introduced to the conference. So at any given time in any annual conference, I suppose a board of ordained ministry they make their decisions based on interviews, and we have a long process, of course, to become a pastor. And so, as I mentioned in my personal experience, there have been gay and lesbian pastors in the United Methodist Church for some time. That was just even my own experience growing up in Kansas City. So I would be lying to you if I told you there are not gay and lesbian pastors in the United Methodist Church. So, and I gave you the rationale that I think most boards of ordained ministry would use for, making such decisions. Now, remember, we are a church that for a long, long time has been an exclusive church with relationship to human sexuality. So do we have a long list of gay and lesbian persons who want to be pastors in our churches? Not so much, right? I mean, we have been an exclusive church in that regard. We have not included all people in the same way. Just like you probably don't have a long list of gay couples who want to get married in your church, I would assume, right? We've not exactly been known as a church in most places that is fully inclusive of all people. And so, in many regards, we have work to do in that regard. Because in the book of discipline, it says, we believe all people are of sacred worth. All people can be members in our churches. All people can be leaders. But I'm not sure if that's always the message that's received in our communities. So hope that helps.
So as far as you know, there are no intention or plans to ordain openly gay pastors at this time prior to 2024?
In our denomination?
I'm sorry.
Anywhere in our denomination, in the United Methodist Church?
Correct.
I wouldn't say I'm aware of plans. I mean, I think every board of ordained, I'm not on our board of ordained ministry, for example. We will receive their report. Scott and I will both be there at clergy session at annual conference. I think boards of ordained ministries are doing their work.
Are you asking for the conference or the entire Methodist church?
Well, both. Actually, I'd like to know.
Yeah.
I'd like to know both.
Well, so we are directing people with questions about our candidates to the Board of Ordained Ministry. There's a chairperson and there's a person in the conference office. I'd be happy to direct you to those people because we have not received the report yet. I mean, Scott and I will both be at clergy session in June when we receive the candidates that have been approved by the board. That's their work. Thank you. I think there's one more here at least. Yep.
Hello. Hi. I just have a question. Maybe I missed it, but what is the reason that this all started? Is there a reason because they're not allowed to be ministers, or why did this even?
Yep. So for decades, the United Methodist Church has had a stance against ordaining gay and lesbian persons. Oh, why is your church talking about disaffiliation? That's a good question, and it might be helpful. I mean, that might be one question that somebody might want to answer tonight instead of waiting until next week. Does someone want to answer that? I can answer that. Okay, how about someone from the leadership team? Does someone on the leadership team want to say, this is why we sent a letter to the conference saying that we want to disaffiliate?
Okay, I can answer that. I was going to ask you a question, but I'll answer that because it kind of goes with my question. By the way, thanks for coming, Cynthia.
Yeah.
Haven't seen you in a while, but we're glad other than the office.
Me too.
For those of you who haven't been with us going to meetings and praying and discerning about a direction for Davie, Cynthia's been very straightforward about the discipline and has referred to the discipline a lot. Those of you who know me know that I'm a rules person. Not that we all keep all the rules all the time, but rules are what makes it go. If we didn't have them, we would have the chaos we see on the news every night. As Methodists, when you joined the church, you took an oath to uphold the discipline of the United Methodist Church. And we trust that from our annual conferences to our general conferences, we will select people to represent us, just like in our government, and they will go and make any changes that the people are requesting. We have an obligation, though, to uphold the discipline as it is written. That's the oath we took before the congregation and before God. Every clergy, whether it's the bishops, whether it's the district superintendents, whether it's fully ordained pastors, whether it's local pastors, deacons, every single one of them took an oath on the Bible before God and the conference to uphold the discipline of the United Methodist Church as written. I am a firm believer in if I don't like something, I'm going to work hard to change it, but I'm not going to defy it or go against it. I am going to work to change it. That's not leadership's role. I'm a child of the 60s, I'm old, and the protests that happened in this country didn't happen by leadership, they happened by people in the streets, the general population. That's where the changes need to be made. To me, our leadership is supposed to be following the discipline they also swore an oath to. And when we see the conflicts and picking and choosing which parts of the discipline people choose to follow, then that's a real problem for me. And I know quite a few of you have the same issue. If you took the oath to uphold it, then all of us should. Do we pick and choose what we believe in the Bible or what God calls us to do? No, we don't. Yes, this is a very loving church. My children grew up here. I grew up at Fulford Methodist. Long before it was a United Methodist Church, as some of you were. And it always comes down to the same thing. Do you trust the leadership to do what is right? Is it broken? And in my opinion, the leadership of the United Methodist Church is broken because they defy the discipline. Give us a chance to find out what the discipline is going to be and let us decide. But don't tell us, here's your rules, and I'll decide which ones I want to follow. And that's the problem right now. Now, I did vote in 2019, like Cynthia said, to stay traditional, and some of the wording became more, I don't even have a word for it. It was hurtful to some people, the way it was worded. Punitive, thank you. That was the word you used, right? Punitive. But if it needs to be changed, then it should be changed first, not defined by leadership. And my feeling is that if there's a number of people in the Methodist Church that don't like the discipline and it can't get changed by voting, then there's a lot of other denominations. But because of all of the fighting, and I have to tell you, I was never embarrassed as a Methodist until I live streamed the 2019 General Conference. That was the most horrible thing I ever saw. I have friends, Baptists, Catholics, everything, that saw it on the national news, and you know what they do, they pick the worst parts, but I watched all of it, and it was all pretty bad, and said, how can those people be Christians? And so to me, what happened with the protocol was that people said, just like Cynthia said, we have to do something. We can't keep doing this. Everyone is looking at us saying, what kind of Christians are you? It doesn't matter how you feel about this particular issue. And so the protocol came about, but now it's been postponed and postponed. And I have no confidence that the protocol that's been out there for 3 years is going to be anything like what's going to happen in 2024. And so I think that's why, as a church, we started looking at all of this, because of the betrayal of leadership. It's broken the system. And I don't know what the system is going to do to fix it, but so the bishops and others in the denomination are just going to break the rules until they get them changed to something they can live with. That's not justice. Justice is when people know what the rules are, and everybody knows what they are, so you know what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to act. That's the whole idea, and you can make a choice for yourself. If you know what the rules are, you can make a choice. Is this the kind of rules that you want to follow, that you believe God intended for us, or do you think that there's some other rules? And so that's where a lot of these people that are here tonight and have been thinking about this and praying about it, this didn't come about in a month or two. There's a whole lot of people here that have been talking about it and praying about it and trying to find a direction. And for those of you who haven't been part of that but came out tonight, thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you'll come next week. But know that it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision that council made to request this disaffiliation process to get started. And it's not ended, of course, and there's still plenty of work to do, but I think that we need to think about all of those things. And I appreciate that Cynthia came here and gave this presentation. She sure didn't have to, because the district put on several of them at other churches, like in groups, so they didn't have to go to so many.
And thank you for that. Thank you for sharing this. I think people
I think that's important, and if you missed it, I mean, I was at an Emmaus training, and they had one at Coral Springs Methodist, so please know that the district is willing to help us, and they've given us the numbers that we needed to know. But again, to me, the leadership is broken, and unless you can tell me how they're going to fix it, instead of just waiting around breaking the rules for 2 more years, I mean, that's the problem I'm having, Cynthia.
Thanks for sharing, and I think Corky speaks for having been a part of the leadership meetings for some time. Kind of hope that helps for new folks here, haven't been fully a part of the conversation, to have an understanding of why this is coming before you as a congregation here at Davie. I remember one other hand from here. Still okay, and then and based on sorry.
Oh yeah, something came into my mind. We're called to be the salt and the light of the earth. Of the earth. And if the salt loses its saltiness, what good are we in the system, in the world? We have to stand out and be different, and we can't just conform to social norms. And that's just what came to me.
Good. I like it when things come to us. One here, yes. And then there was one other over here, too, yes.
Hi, I'm speaking on behalf of me and my husband, Paul, that he's been a member for over 70 years.
Hey, Paul.
Been for 49 years. I understand that things aren't perfect in our church. Our leaders aren't perfect. Everything isn't perfect. And to me, I speak to people here in this place in the last weeks and the last few months. People don't understand what's going on, and they haven't really understood what the problem people thought it was about the situations. And they're very happy. Many people are very happy to be part of the United States. But we've been with the Methodist Church for 100 years, and here at our church we've celebrated that now it's over 100 years, and I think we can still work together and make it better and improve the parts that are not right. And but Paul, he wrote down for me what we wanted to say, and he says he doesn't really understand why not everybody, but the group wants that. We have had so much support through all kinds of situations for in and out, but we've always got a lot of support. Everybody's not perfect. Pastors aren't perfect. Everybody's not perfect. We've been through a lot. But we've always stuck together and not just given up and saying, okay, they're not perfect, let's give it up and try something, out someplace else, let's not work on it, because we've been through a lot of different things, and we've always been blessed. And the working together, I think, is part of the blessing.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. It's all right now. Yeah, no applause. We can just say a couple amens here and there. We want to respect everybody's voice.
You've talked a lot about the discipline, the Book of Discipline, and I'm very familiar with the Book of Discipline. And I guess my question is, if there's clergy, there's people that are unhappy with the Book of Discipline, the way it's written, and they're, for justice sake, breaking the rules in the Book of Discipline, why aren't they the ones that are leaving the Methodist Church, the
Yeah.
United Methodist Church? Why are the traditionalists
Yeah, very.
the ones that are leaving?
Excellent question. Because they wanted to, actually. So when the leaders of the more traditional groups and the more progressive leaders and centrists, when they met with the mediator, what the traditionalists brought to the table was, we want to leave. So everybody kind of brought their voice, and that was their voice. We want to leave, we want a way to leave, and we want it to be financially viable for us to leave. And so the protocol represents that. It represents a way for traditionalist churches to leave. They were going to get paid some money to leave as a group, and then some of the from the United Methodist Church. The protocol says that a new denomination of traditional churches will be paid $20 million. That was part of what was negotiated. Will that stick after a pandemic? I don't know. I don't know. But actually, that is an excellent question, and that has been the desire of the traditional group for some time, to not stick with the United Methodist Church, but to form a new church. And there's energy for that formation of a new church, which perhaps some of you are familiar with.
Why did the gentleman say it was corrupt?
I don't know. I'd rather not. Well, let me do this. I want us to stick with questions, because I know it's getting late.
I think it's something we can talk about a
So
little bit more
maybe May
next week.
3rd, next week, when you're talking about your church's plan. So remember, next week, same time, same place, 7:30, leadership will let you know more about the reasons why, and then what the plans are, what we're going to call ourselves, how we would be affiliated, what would be our new book of discipline, how our pastor would be credentialed, how we're going to be insured, all those things that should be very important to you going forward. So bring that up next week. All right? I encourage you to. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you, and it's not about the book of discipline. I want to know how many missionaries are actually in the United Methodist Church.
That's such a good question. Let's see. I would just be picking a number out of the air.
I think
mean,
somebody
hundreds,
must
but
know in this church, because that doesn't make sense to me.
That we don't know?
That you wouldn't know.
Well, except that there's a lot, and I'm not, in a particular way involved with, we have missionaries all over the world. So I don't know the number.
Well, the Methodist Church all over the world is not necessarily the United Methodist. The United Methodist Church...
Sorry, the United Methodist Church, our mission agency is based in Atlanta. So I'm actually talking about our missionaries. I'm talking about our United Methodist missionaries that are sent around the world. And actually, I was just sitting next to, at breakfast yesterday, at a meeting in Texas, Roland Fernandez, who's the head of Global Ministries.
Can we Google it?
Maybe. I'm sure we have a few hundred.
Doesn't that seem appalling, a few hundred?
I don't know.
Should be thousands.
Well, maybe. We have 3 young adult missionaries living in a house in Miami who are working in Miami, which is wonderful.
Well, that's in the United States. missionaries reach in the rest of the world.
But guess what? Other countries are now sending missionaries to our country.
How about that? That's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yep. The country that sends the most missionaries around the world, you know which country it is?
Africa.
Korea. South Korea.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yep.
Another question is, I find that some of the questions being asked, people aren't aware of what's going on, and this is not new, like you said, 2019 or something like that? Did it begin before this, disaffiliation talk, or differences of opinions?
Yeah, our differences of opinions is decades old around this issue. But disaffiliation in the last few years, more the last few years.
In my family, there's been several Methodist ministers. They were not United Methodist because it was prior to United Methodist. So people have to realize United Methodist is not the only Methodist out there, right? Am I right? Or
well,
am I wrong?
all those prior, there are other churches like the Free Methodist, et cetera, but in terms of prior to the United Methodist Church, they all became the United Methodist Church.
In the United States.
Yeah, Methodist Episcopal.
Worldwide, there's a whole bunch of Methodists that are not United Methodist. Am I right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we have to...
They're affiliated denominations. Good job.
Okay.
Good job. What's the question?
My
What's the
other
question?
question is, I do not understand why these issues aren't being brought up in every single United Methodist church, and why they're just picking a few to bring up this topic of disaffiliation. How do you have critical thinking when you don't know what's going on?
So who's picking the few?
I don't know.
You actually picked us.
I know there are churches, United Methodist churches, that don't have a clue of any of this.
Right. So.
And why would that be?
Well,
that's my question.
Well, I think churches, so in the Southeast District, I'll be honest with you, some of our churches have bigger fish to fry, like, can we stay open another year, right? So if you're worried about whether your church can stay open another year, you're probably not talking about same-sex weddings in your sanctuary. I'm just being honest, right? So we've got a spectrum of churches struggling with a spectrum of issues or celebrating many things, right? You've got churches that are doing homeless ministry, et cetera, and this just may not be either on their radar or they don't want it to be on their radar. But
if we don't know it, that it's even there, if they don't know that it's even there, I mean the parishioners, if you're not aware that it's even a thing, how can you use critical thinking both sides of the aisle?
Well,
and come to a conclusion.
I would say many are aware.
I don't think so.
Okay, so I mean, we can disagree about that. In this case, though, so we don't pick churches to talk about disaffiliation. Remember, your church sent me a letter. So actually, your church is asking me to come talk with you about disaffiliation. Okay, so it's not coming from us.
Okay.
It's coming from
And thank you very much.
Yes.
This has been very informative to me. And I have a heart for the Methodist Church, regardless of whether it's United. I remember when it wasn't United Methodist. I remember it was Methodist.
Yeah, before 1968.
And the Book of Discipline was written then, when the United Methodist started, or did it come from the
Well,
Methodist
we've always
Church?
had a Book of Discipline since the very, very beginning, but the United Methodist Church began in 1968. So kind of our modern day, every 4 years, et cetera.
So I was 8 years old.
Kind of dates back to that. So thank you for your interest. And of course, do we all want more people to be more informed? Absolutely, about all kinds of things. If only we were all doing disciple Bible study and reading the Bible in a year, right? And there are all kinds of things we could be more informed about. So I think, certainly as a baseline, any opportunity we have to be together in this way is a joy for me. I want it to remind us of our need, as we talked about at the beginning, to be very gracious with each other, right? To be very gracious with each other. You have known each other a long time, and God is clearly in this place. And so I want you to be gracious with each other, even in your differences, potential differences of opinion around this, all right? So to give us a framework for where we are, your church council sent me a letter in the conference saying we'd like to begin the process toward disaffiliation, which is your council's prerogative to talk about and vote on doing that, okay? Part of the checklist is me coming to have this information session with you tonight. I'm here. And in our conversations about what's next, we also knew that what would be needed is another conversation for you to get the answers to all the questions I can't answer, right? About what's being proposed about your future. What would we call ourselves, right? How would we be governed, et cetera. So next week, Tuesday, 7:30, come to get answers to those questions. After that, your council will meet to formalize, should they choose, formalize a motion for disaffiliation. We have a date on the calendar of 4 o'clock on May the 15th. Should your leadership continue to discern, based on tonight, based on next week, to move forward, I will be back with you at 4 o'clock on May the 15th in order for there to be a motion from your leadership and for us to vote together, okay? At that time, there would be, we'd probably have 3 speeches for and against, a couple of minutes each. It's going to be a little bit more formal. It's not going to be as much information time. I mean, we'll share some things, but that's for tonight and next week, okay? So be sure to get the information you need. And that evening, we'll have time for a presentation from your leadership on whatever motion is coming, and then for there to be conversation about it, and for there to be a vote, okay? So I want you all to know kind of how we see this timeline, okay? And your leadership has been very helpful with me, and we've tried to be thoughtful in putting this together for you in order for you to have the information you need, okay? Anything else for the good of the cause for this evening? You've really hung with us.
Can we give a hand for Reverend Cynthia Weems for being here? And I just wanted to say thank you to her. She has been very gracious and very kind and very helpful. We all know this is a difficult process and conversation, and she's been 100% professional and just awesome through it all. And so she's going to continue to help us through this process. And like she said, this is a process that will continue next week. On Tuesday at 7:30, we ask all of you to come back, and we're going to get into more of the things that have to do with this particular church. And we will, after that point, make a decision from the council's standpoint to decide whether or not the vote will take place or not. Mm-hmm. So if you're upset about whatever's happening right now, please realize this isn't the end of the story. This is really the beginning of it, and we still have more work to do. So be in prayer for each other, and be in prayer for Cynthia and for the church and the denomination. Amen?
Amen. And for your leadership, for continued discernment, as Pastor Scott mentioned, just prayer and discernment around all that people are hearing and sharing. That's part of our life together. I'd love to invite us all to stand, and could we say the Lord's Prayer together? All right, let's pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Go in peace, my friends. Thanks so much.